Every parent knows that moment when you realize you can't shield your child from everything. For Darien Hendricks, that moment came 6 months after burying his wife, when his 8-year-old son pointed to their backyard and said the words that would change everything. Darien had been doing his best to hold their small world together in their North Carolina home, making breakfast, packing lunches, and pretending that the empty chair at their kitchen table didn't break his heart every morning. When young Kenneth came running inside talking about something strange in the old oak tree, Darien figured it was just another bee problem. He grabbed his coffee and walked outside to take a look. What he found wasn't bees at all. Inside that massive hive was something that made his hands shake so badly he dropped his mug and immediately called 911. The thing moving inside that hive would force him to confront fears he'd buried since his wife's death and question everything about protecting his son. What exactly did Darien see that terrified him so much? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains the same way it had for the past 6 months, casting familiar shadows across the breakfast table where Darien Hendricks sat with his son Kenneth. The routine had become sacred. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and orange juice served on the same blue plates Vanessa had picked out during their first year of marriage. Darien moved through the motions with practiced precision, each gesture a small act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed their lives since cancer took his wife. "Dad, you're making your worried face again," Kenneth observed, looking up from his cereal bowl with eyes that seemed far too perceptive for an 8-year-old. Those eyes, deep brown like his mother's, had learned to read the subtle changes in his father's expression. The way adults learn to predict weather by watching clouds, Darien forced a smile, the kind he'd perfected in front of bathroom mirrors during the darkest months. "Just thinking about the school day ahead, buddy. You ready for that math test?" Kenneth nodded, but his attention had already drifted toward the window that looked out onto their backyard. The old oak tree dominated the view, its massive trunk and sprawling branches creating a canopy that had sheltered 3 generations of the Henderson family before them. When Darien and Vanessa had bought this modest 2-story house in Charlotte's Brookshire neighborhood, that tree had been the deciding factor. Vanessa had stood beneath it during their first walkthrough, arms spread wide, declaring it the perfect spot for future tire swings and tree houses. The house itself told the story of a young couple's dreams, hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, a kitchen with enough counter space for ambitious holiday meals, and a living room with built-in bookshelves that Vanessa had immediately begun filling with volumes on everything from gardening to local history. The walls still held her photographs, Kenneth's first steps, family camping trips to the Blue Ridge Mountains, and countless candid moments that now felt like glimpses into someone else's life. Darien taught American history at Myers Park High School, a job that had once felt like a calling, but now served mainly as a way to maintain normalcy. His students respected him, Mr. Hendricks, who never raised his voice but somehow commanded attention through quiet authority and genuine care for their futures. He'd been teaching for 15 years, long enough to see former students return as adults with children of their own, long enough to understand that teenagers desperately needed adults who listened without judgment. But these days, standing in front of a classroom discussing the civil rights movement or the complexities of Reconstruction, Darien often felt like he was performing a role rather than living his life. The subjects that had once ignited passion in both him and his students now felt distant. Academic exercises rather than living history that shaped their daily reality. The neighborhood around them had evolved over the years, transforming from a predominantly working-class area to a diverse community where old-timers like Mrs. Roosevelt lived alongside young families like the Patels across the street. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, no relation to the former First Lady, though she wore the name with pride, had been their neighbor for 30 years. At 78, she maintained a garden that made suburban landscaping magazines jealous and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family that had ever lived on Sycamore Drive. That woman keeps track of everything. Vanessa used to say, with fond exasperation, after Mrs. Roosevelt would appear at their fence line with detailed reports about package deliveries, unusual visitors, or changes in wildlife patterns. "She's like our neighborhood historian. The Patel family had moved in 2 years ago. Dr. Raj Patel, his wife Priya, and their twin daughters who were Kenneth's age. Raj worked as a pediatrician at Carolina Medical Center, while Priya taught computer science at the local community college. Their daughters, Asha and Meera, had quickly become Kenneth's closest friends, the three of them forming an inseparable trio that spent summer afternoons building elaborate fort systems and winter weekends sledding down the gentle slope behind the elementary school. Since Vanessa's death, these neighbors had become more than friendly acquaintances. They'd become Kenneth's extended family and Darien's lifeline during the darkest moments. Mrs. Roosevelt appeared regularly with casseroles and wisdom, dispensed in equal measure. The Patels included Kenneth in family activities without making it feel like charity, understanding instinctively that what he needed most was normalcy rather than pity. The house held memories in every corner. Vanessa's coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, the one with faded flowers that she'd used every morning for 12 years. Her gardening gloves remained on the back porch hook, fingers still shaped by the hands that had tended roses and vegetables with equal devotion. The master bedroom closet retained the faint scent of her perfume, a floral fragrance that sometimes caught Darien off guard when he reached for clean shirts. Kenneth had handled the loss with remarkable resilience, though Darien worried constantly about the emotions his son might be suppressing. Children, his pediatrician had explained, often process grief differently than adults, sometimes appearing to move forward normally while working through complex feelings in private moments. Kenneth still talked to his mother's photograph each night before bed, sharing details about school and friends with the same casual intimacy he'd always shown. "Mom would have liked Mrs. Patterson," he'd say, referring to his new second-grade teacher. Or I think Mom knew this would happen when discussing some minor childhood milestone. These conversations, overheard through the thin wall between their bedrooms, both comforted and worried Darien. Was it healthy processing or avoidance? The financial pressures had been manageable, thanks to Vanessa's life insurance policy and Darien's steady teaching income. But the emotional landscape remained treacherous territory. Some days Darien felt like they were genuinely healing, building new traditions, and finding joy in simple moments. Other days, usually triggered by some unexpected reminder, a song on the radio, the smell of Vanessa's favorite cookies baking at a neighbor's house, grief would crash over them with devastating suddenness. Darien had tried counseling, both individual sessions and family therapy with Kenneth, but had found more comfort in practical routines and the steady support of their community. Tuesday evening dinners at Mrs. Roosevelt's house had become sacred. Friday afternoon walks with the Patel family provided structure and connection. Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market, where Vanessa had always bought fresh flowers, maintained a tradition while creating new memories. The backyard oak tree had become Kenneth's favorite retreat. He'd climb to the lowest branches with a book or sketch pad, spending hours absorbed in private worlds that Darien respected but couldn't access. Sometimes, sitting on the back porch with his own coffee, Darien would watch his son in that tree and feel a deep contentment mixed with protective concern. Kenneth was growing up, developing independence and inner strength, but was he growing up too fast? "Dad," Kenneth's voice pulled him back to the present moment. "I said the tree looks different today." Darien followed his son's gaze toward the oak, squinting against the morning sunlight. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The same massive trunk, the same familiar branch configuration, the same patches of moss that had always decorated the bark. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed what Kenneth had seen. Near the highest accessible branches, something large and oddly shaped clung to the trunk, probably just a bird's nest that got blown around in last night's storm, Darien said. though even as he spoke he felt uncertain. The shape seemed too regular, too deliberately constructed to be the result of weather patterns. Kenneth shook his head with the certainty that only children possess. "It's not a bird's nest, Dad. It looks like it's moving." Darien set down his coffee mug, the simple white ceramic cup that had replaced the fancy mugs they'd owned when Vanessa was alive, and moved closer to the window. The object in the tree was definitely not a natural formation. It appeared to be some kind of hive or nest, but larger than any bee or wasp structure he'd ever encountered. The surface seemed to pulse, slightly as if breathing, and the color shifted between brown and gray in a way that suggested organic construction but unnatural composition. "We'll take a look after breakfast," he promised Kenneth, though something in his chest had begun to tighten with an anxiety he couldn't name. Probably just bees looking for a new home. But as they finished their morning routine, dishes washed and put away, backpack packed with homework and lunch, shoes tied and jacket retrieved from the hall closet, Darien found his attention returning repeatedly to that strange formation in their beloved oak tree. Something about it felt wrong in a way, that had nothing to do with natural insect behavior and everything to do with the protective instincts that had sharpened since becoming a single father. The drive to Kenneth's elementary school followed familiar streets, lined with modest homes and established trees. They passed Mrs. Roosevelt's perfectly maintained garden, the Patel house with bicycles scattered across the front lawn, and the corner store where Kenneth occasionally bought candy with carefully saved allowance money. These daily landmarks had become anchors of stability, proof that their world remained predictable and safe, despite the enormous changes they'd weathered. "Have a good day, buddy," Darien said as Kenneth climbed out of the car at the school's front entrance. "I love you. Love you too, Dad. Don't forget to check on that thing in the tree." Kenneth disappeared into the stream of children flowing toward the school building, his backpack bouncing with each step. Darien watched until his son was safely inside, then began the drive to Myers Park High School, his mind already shifting toward lesson plans and the stack of papers that needed grading. But throughout the day, as he discussed the complexities of the Great Depression with 5 different classes of 10th graders, part of his attention remained focused on that inexplicable structure clinging to their oak tree. By the time school ended and he'd finished his usual after-hours grading session, the afternoon sun had shifted the shadows in their backyard, making the mysterious formation more visible from the kitchen window. Darien poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and stepped onto the back porch, studying the object with growing unease. It was definitely not a natural bee or wasp nest. The structure appeared to be at least 4 feet in diameter, constructed from some kind of papery material that gleamed with an oily sheen. Most disturbing was the subtle but unmistakable movement, not the random activity of insects, but a rhythmic pulsing that suggested something large and alive inside. When Kenneth arrived home from his after-school program, dropped off by Mrs. Patel with his usual cheerful energy, his first question was about the tree. "Did you figure out what it is, Dad?" Darien set down his coffee mug on the porch railing and considered his options. He could deflect, promise to investigate later, and hope the structure would prove to be harmless. Or he could satisfy both his son's curiosity and his own growing concern by taking a closer look right now. "Let's go see," he decided, leading Kenneth across the yard toward the oak tree that had been the centerpiece of so many family memories. The closer they got, the more obviously unnatural the structure became. The surface wasn't made of the paper-like material that wasps used for their nests, but something that looked almost like hardened silk or resin. And the movement inside was becoming impossible to ignore. Something sizable shifting position, creating visible bulges that pressed against the exterior walls. "Dad," Kenneth whispered, his voice tight with a fear that made Darien's protective instincts surge. "There's something in there that's not supposed to be." Darien was about to respond when the structure suddenly split along one side, revealing a dark opening that exhaled a smell like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic and wrong. And in that moment, as his coffee mug fell from nerveless fingers and shattered against the ground, he saw exactly what had been moving inside the hive. It wasn't an insect. It wasn't an animal. It was something that made his hands shake as he grabbed Kenneth and backed away from the tree, his phone already in his hand. Fingers fumbling to dial 911. The emergency operator's voice crackled through Darien's phone with professional calm that contrasted sharply with his racing heartbeat. 911, what's your emergency? There's something in my backyard, Darien managed, his voice steadier than he felt as he pulled Kenneth behind him, putting distance between them and the oak tree. Something that shouldn't be there. In a hive or nest, but it's not an animal. Sir, can you be more specific? Are you reporting an injured person? Darien glanced back at the structure, which had partially closed again, but still emanated that disturbing organic smell. How could he explain what he'd glimpsed in those few seconds? Something pale and writhing, roughly human-sized, that had made his mind recoil from processing the details. I think someone might be trapped, he said finally, the words feeling both true and completely inadequate. Send paramedics and police. 1247 Sycamore Drive. Kenneth pressed close against his side, and Darien could feel his son trembling. The boy's face had gone pale, his usual curious confidence replaced by an expression of profound disturbance that made Darien's chest tighten with protective fury. Kenneth, go inside and wait for me, okay? Stay in the living room. I don't want to leave you alone with that thing. Dad, the simple honesty in his son's voice, the way Kenneth had instinctively recognized that whatever was in the tree posed a genuine threat, sent a chill through Darien. 8-year-olds weren't supposed to possess such acute awareness of danger. I'll be right behind you. Go! Kenneth ran toward the house, his backpack bouncing, and Darien followed, but stopped on the porch to maintain visual contact with the oak tree. The emergency vehicles would arrive soon, and then professionals could determine what exactly they were dealing with. But as he waited, watching that unnatural structure pulse with subtle life, Darien couldn't shake the feeling that this moment represented a fundamental shift in their carefully reconstructed world. The first responders arrived within 8 minutes. Charlotte, Mecklenburg. Police followed closely by paramedics and a fire truck that seemed excessive for the situation, but somehow reassuring in its solid, practical presence. Officer Martinez, a compact woman with kind eyes and an air of competent authority, listened to Darien's explanation while her partner examined the tree from a safe distance. You said you saw something inside that looked human, she asked, making notes in a small tablet. I think so. It was only for a second, but Darien paused, aware of how insane his words would sound. There was definitely something large moving in there, and the smell is wrong. Like decay, but not exactly. The paramedic team, led by a veteran EMT named Rodriguez, who'd seen enough unusual calls to maintain professional skepticism while keeping an open mind, approached the oak tree with caution. They carried equipment for extracting injured persons from confined spaces, though none of them had encountered anything quite like this situation. The structure appears to be organic, Rodriguez reported via radio. Constructed material, but not by any insect species I'm familiar with. We're going to need specialists. Kenneth watched from the living room window, his face pressed against the glass, despite Darien's instructions to stay away from the windows. When Darien joined him inside, he found his son holding a piece of paper covered with crayon drawings. I drew what I saw, Kenneth said quietly. Handing over the paper, Darien studied the drawing with growing unease. Kenneth had always been artistic, inheriting Vanessa's eye for detail and natural talent with visual representation. But this drawing displayed a precision and attention to disturbing details that seemed beyond his years. The hive was rendered with remarkable accuracy, including the oily sheen and the pulsing bulges. But most unsettling was Kenneth's depiction of what lay inside, a figure that was unmistakably humanoid, but wrong in ways that made Darien's skin crawl. Kenneth, how did you see these details? We were pretty far from the tree, his son shrugged with the casual acceptance of children who haven't yet learned that some experiences are supposed to be impossible. I could just see it, Dad, like when I know it's going to rain before the clouds come. Before Darien could process the implications of this statement, Officer Martinez knocked on their front door. Behind her stood a tall, thin man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Dr. Wesley Chen from the North Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Quality. Mr. Hendricks, we'd like to ask you some questions about what you observed. And I understand your son also witnessed the incident. Kenneth showed Dr. Chen his drawing without prompting, and Darien watched the specialist's expression shift from professional courtesy to sharp attention. Dr. Chen studied the drawing for a long moment, then looked at Kenneth with newfound interest. This is very detailed. You have an excellent memory for observation. Kenneth has always been perceptive, Darien said, though he was beginning to realize that his son's abilities might extend beyond normal childhood awareness. Dr. Chen requested permission to examine the backyard more thoroughly, and within an hour, their quiet neighborhood had transformed into a scene of controlled scientific investigation. Specialists in hazmat suits took samples from the structure, while others used equipment Darien didn't recognize to scan the tree and surrounding area. Mrs. Roosevelt appeared at her fence line, her usual friendly curiosity replaced by obvious concern. "Darien, dear, is everything all right? Those men have been here for hours." "We're not sure yet, Mrs. Roosevelt. Something unusual in the oak tree. Hopefully nothing serious." But even as he spoke, Darien noticed that Mrs. Roosevelt's expression had shifted to something that looked like recognition rather than surprise. Her weathered hands gripped the fence tightly, and her eyes kept returning to the activity around the tree, with an intensity that suggested personal familiarity with such situations. By evening, the initial investigation had yielded more questions than answers. The structure was indeed organic, but constructed from materials that didn't match any known insect or animal secretions. The interior contained evidence of something large having recently vacated the space, but no clear indication of what that something might have been. "We're going to need to quarantine this area temporarily," Dr. Chen informed Darien as the emergency vehicles prepared to leave, "until we can determine exactly what we're dealing with." Yellow tape now surrounded their beloved oak tree, and a security officer would remain on site overnight to monitor the situation. Kenneth accepted these developments with the adaptability that had helped him weather his mother's death. But Darien could see the stress accumulating in the tight line of his son's shoulders, and the way he checked the locks on their doors twice before bedtime. "Dad, are we safe in our house?" Kenneth asked as Darien tucked him into bed. "Yes, buddy. All those people out there are making sure everything's secure. But what if that thing comes back? What if there are more of them?" Darien sat on the edge of Kenneth's bed, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what we saw today, but I promise you, I won't let anything hurt you." Kenneth nodded, accepting his father's promise with the faith that children place in their parents' ability to control an uncontrollable world. But as Darien turned off the light and headed toward his own bedroom, he couldn't escape the feeling that today's events had shattered something fundamental about their sense of safety and normalcy. The house felt different that night. Sounds seemed amplified, shadows appeared deeper, and the familiar creaks and settling noises took on ominous significance. Darien found himself checking on Kenneth multiple times, standing in the doorway of his son's room to watch the steady rise and fall of sleeping breath that confirmed everything was still normal, still safe. From his bedroom window, he could see the security lights illuminating the quarantined oak tree. The structure remained motionless, but Darien couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside it was still nearby, watching and waiting. His phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Roosevelt. "We should talk tomorrow. There are things you need to know." Darien stared at the message, understanding instinctively that his elderly neighbor possessed knowledge that could help them make sense of today's impossibilities. But he also sensed that whatever Mrs. Roosevelt needed to share would fundamentally change how he understood their neighborhood, their home, and perhaps the nature of reality itself. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Darien's last conscious thought was of Kenneth's drawing, those precise, disturbing details that suggested his 8-year-old son had seen far more than should have been possible from their position near the house. And somewhere in the space between waking and dreaming, he began to suspect that the strange structure in their oak tree might have been responding to something special about Kenneth himself. Kenneth's dreams came in vivid colors that bled into his waking thoughts, leaving him disoriented and exhausted despite a full night's sleep. Over breakfast, he described visions of underground tunnels filled with amber light, voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood, and the persistent feeling that someone was calling his name from a great distance. Just nightmares. Buddy, Darien said, though Kenneth's descriptions didn't sound like typical childhood fears, they possessed a coherent narrative structure and consistent imagery that suggested something deeper than stress-induced imagination. They don't feel like nightmares, Dad. They feel like memories. The simple certainty in Kenneth's voice sent a chill through Darien. 8-year-olds didn't typically speak of memories they couldn't possibly possess, especially memories involving impossible underground landscapes and mysterious voices. Mrs. Roosevelt arrived at their back door before 9 o'clock, carrying a leather-bound journal that looked decades old and wearing an expression of determined resolve that transformed her usually gentle features into something formidable. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, settling herself at their kitchen table and opening the journal to reveal pages covered with meticulous handwriting. Pressed flowers and detailed sketches of various plants and insects. "Eleanor, what's this about?" Darien asked, though he suspected the answer would somehow relate to yesterday's impossible discoveries. "I've been keeping track of unusual occurrences in this neighborhood for 37 years, Mrs. Roosevelt said, turning pages that revealed dates, weather conditions, and descriptions of events that defied conventional explanation. Strange lights in the sky, animals behaving in unnatural ways, children displaying abilities they shouldn't possess. Kenneth moved closer to examine the journal, his eyes widening as he recognized images that matched his recent dreams. "Mrs. Roosevelt, I've seen these places. In my sleep. I know, dear. Your mother saw them too." The words hit Darien like a physical blow. "What do you mean Vanessa saw them?" Mrs. Roosevelt turned to a section of the journal marked with a pressed white rose, the same variety that Vanessa had grown in their garden. "Your wife came to me about 2 years before she became ill. She was experiencing dreams similar to Kenneth's, and she'd noticed unusual things around the neighborhood that other people seemed to overlook. The journal entries revealed a pattern of supernatural occurrences spanning decades, carefully documented by Mrs. Roosevelt's precise observations. Children born in certain houses displayed enhanced intuition or precognitive abilities. Animals avoided specific areas during particular seasonal transitions. Plants grew in impossible configurations near underground water sources that city records claimed didn't exist. Vanessa helped me understand the pattern," Mrs. Roosevelt continued, her finger tracing entries written in 2 different handwritings, her own careful script and Vanessa's flowing cursive. "The occurrences cluster around children with particular sensitivity to what we came to call the deeper currents, forces that flow beneath the surface of ordinary reality." Kenneth studied a sketch of children playing near a structure that looked remarkably similar to the hive they'd discovered in their oak tree. "Are we in danger, Mrs. Roosevelt?" "Not danger exactly, dear, but change is coming, and your father needs to understand what's happening so he can help you navigate it safely." Darien felt the foundations of his carefully reconstructed world shifting again. Yesterday, he'd been a single father dealing with the normal challenges of raising a son alone. Today, he was apparently part of some multi-generational supernatural mystery that his deceased wife had been investigating in secret. "Why didn't Vanessa tell me about any of this?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "She was protecting you," Mrs. Roosevelt said gently. "And she was protecting Kenneth. Some knowledge comes with responsibility, and she wasn't sure you were ready to accept what that responsibility might require." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Dr. Chen's voice carried an urgency that made Darien's chest tighten. "Mr. Hendricks, we need you to bring Kenneth to the site immediately. We've discovered something that requires his input." Outside, the quarantined area around their oak tree had expanded significantly. Additional specialists had arrived overnight, along with equipment that looked more suited to archaeological excavation than biological investigation. Dr. Chen met them at the tape perimeter, his usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled excitement. "The structure has responded to your son's proximity," he said without preamble. "When we showed it samples of fabric from Kenneth's clothing, the interior began exhibiting organized patterns of activity." Kenneth stepped closer to the tree, and Darien immediately noticed changes in the hive-like structure. What had appeared dormant and sealed yesterday now showed signs of purposeful movement, with sections opening and closing in rhythmic sequences that resembled breathing or communication attempts. "It's trying to talk," Kenneth said matter-of-factly, as if conversing with alien structures was a normal part of childhood experience. "Talk to what?" Dr. Chen asked, pulling out recording equipment. "To me. It wants to show me something, but it's scared of all these people," the casual certainty in Kenneth's voice made. Several of the specialists exchanged meaningful glances. Dr. Chen approached Darien with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Hendricks, I realize this is an unusual request, but would you consider allowing Kenneth to approach the structure more closely, under careful supervision, with full safety protocols?" Every parental instinct in Darien's body screamed against the idea. "Absolutely not. I'm not putting my son at risk for your research." "Dad," Kenneth said quietly, tugging at his father's sleeve, "it won't hurt me. It's more afraid than I am. How can you possibly know that?" Kenneth shrugged with the maddening logic of children who haven't yet learned to doubt their perceptions. "Because it's been waiting for me. And it knew my mom." The implications of Kenneth's statement rippled through the assembled specialists like a physical force. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from scientific curiosity to something approaching. "Oh, your mother had contact with this entity?" Mrs. Roosevelt stepped forward, her journal clutched against her chest like a protective talisman. "Vanessa documented several encounters with similar structures over the past few years. She believed they were attracted to children with heightened sensitivity to paranormal phenomena." "This is insane," Darien muttered. But even as he spoke, he found himself studying Kenneth's face. His son showed no fear, only the kind of anticipatory excitement that usually preceded Christmas morning or birthday parties. "Please, Dad, I need to see what it wants to show me." The assembled adults fell silent, waiting for Darien's decision. In the background, normal neighborhood life continued, Mrs. Patel walking her dog, the postal carrier making his rounds, children playing in yards, blissfully unaware of the supernatural drama unfolding 3 houses away. Darien looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something that hadn't been there a week ago. Kenneth's eyes held depths that seemed too mature for his 8 years, and his posture conveyed a quiet confidence that suggested he understood far more about their situation than any child should. 5 minutes, Darien said finally, "with full safety gear, and I stay within arm's reach." Kenneth smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Darien had seen from him since Vanessa's death, and stepped toward the oak tree that had sheltered 3 generations of their neighbors, but apparently harbored secrets that stretched far beyond normal human experience. The structure responded immediately to Kenneth's approach, its surface brightening and its rhythmic pulsing accelerating like a heartbeat, responding to excitement or recognition. And as his son reached out to touch the strange material, Darien realized that yesterday's discovery had been only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought. He knew about protecting the people he loved. The attic ladder creaked under Darien's weight as he climbed toward boxes they hadn't opened since moving into the house 5 years ago. Kenneth's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called that morning with concerns about his recent behavior, not disruptive or problematic, but unnaturally insightful in ways that made her uncomfortable. When she'd mentioned Kenneth's detailed drawings of places that couldn't exist, and his ability to predict minor classroom events before they happened, Darien had realized he needed to search for answers in the one place he'd been avoiding: Vanessa's personal papers. The attic held the accumulated history of their marriage: photo albums, college textbooks, and boxes labeled in Vanessa's careful handwriting. Most were exactly what he'd expected: holiday decorations, old tax returns, and sentimental items too precious to discard, but too painful to display. But wedged behind a stack of Christmas ornament containers, he found a box marked "Research Private" in letters that seemed somehow more urgent than Vanessa's usual organization system. Inside, Darien discovered a world his wife had kept hidden from him. Folders contained printouts from scientific journals about unexplained phenomena, correspondence with researchers from universities across the country, and detailed maps of their neighborhood marked with symbols he didn't recognize. But most disturbing were Vanessa's personal journals, filled with entries that read like field notes from an impossible investigation. March 15th. Kenneth exhibited precognitive awareness again today. He warned me about the broken pipe in Mrs. Roosevelt's basement 2 days before it actually burst. When I asked how he knew, he said the underground voices told him. Need to research connection between his abilities and local geological features. April 2nd, made contact with Dr. Santos in California. She confirms similar patterns in other locations with high supernatural activity. Children born to sensitive parents often develop enhanced abilities around age 7 to 8, critical to understand whether Kenneth's gifts are natural, evolution, or response to external influence. June 10th. The structures are appearing more frequently. Mrs. Roosevelt has documented 7 instances in the past month. They seem drawn to children with developing abilities, but their intentions remain unclear. Must investigate connection to underground water systems and mineral deposits. Darien sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by evidence of his wife's secret life, feeling as though he'd never really known the woman he'd been married to for 12 years. Why hadn't she shared these discoveries with him? Why had she carried this burden alone? His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Roosevelt. Kenneth is having another episode. Come quickly. Darien raced across their yards to find Kenneth standing in Mrs. Roosevelt's garden, his eyes unfocused and his voice speaking words in a language that sounded both ancient and otherworldly. Mrs. Roosevelt held his shoulders gently, her expression concerned but not panicked. How long has he been like this? Darien asked, kneeling beside his son. About 10 minutes. He came over asking about the singing in the ground and then just started talking like this. Kenneth's voice carried a strange resonance, as if multiple people were speaking through him simultaneously. The words were incomprehensible, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Urgent communication from someone or something trying to convey critical information. "Kenneth, can you hear me?" Darien said, taking his son's face in his hands. Kenneth's eyes focused gradually, the strange language fading into normal speech. "Dad, they're trying to warn us about something. The people underground, they're scared." "What people, buddy?" "The ones who built the hives. They've been protecting children like me for a long time, but something's coming that they can't stop." Mrs. Roosevelt exchanged a meaningful look with Darien. "We need to call Dr. Santos immediately." "Who is Dr. Santos?" Darien asked, though he'd seen the name in Vanessa's research notes. "Someone your wife trusted. Someone who understands what Kenneth is becoming." The phone call with Dr. Kimberly Santos reached at UC Berkeley's Department of Anthropological Sciences, provided context that made Darien's discoveries both more comprehensible and more terrifying. Dr. Santos had been studying unexplained phenomena in children for 15 years, documenting cases across multiple continents where young people developed supernatural abilities in response to what she termed dimensional proximity events. "Your wife was one of my most valuable research partners," Dr. Santos explained via video call, her kind face framed by graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Vanessa understood that Kenneth's abilities weren't random mutations but part of a larger pattern of human evolution accelerated by contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. Non-terrestrial intelligence. Darien repeated, feeling the last vestiges of normal reality crumbling around him. The entities that create those hive structures exist in a parallel dimension that occasionally intersects with our own. They've been monitoring and protecting gifted children for centuries, possibly millennia. But Vanessa's final communications suggested that something had changed, that other forces had become aware of these children and intended to exploit their abilities. Kenneth, who had been listening quietly, spoke up with unsettling clarity. The bad people are coming soon. The underground voices keep saying, we need to choose, hide or fight. Dr. Santos leaned closer to her camera, her expression sharpening with concern. Kenneth, when the voices speak to you, do they show you images of other children like yourself? Yes, there are lots of us all over the world, but some of them disappeared. And the voices are sad about it. The implications of Kenneth's words settled over the adults like a heavy blanket. Dr. Santos confirmed what they were all beginning to understand. Kenneth and children like him were being systematically identified and taken by organizations that viewed their supernatural abilities as resources to be harvested rather than gifts to be protected. Vanessa's cancer wasn't natural, Dr. Santos said quietly. The medical records she shared with me showed cellular degeneration patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to dimensional energy. She was channeling protective barriers around Kenneth, using her own life force to shield him from detection. Darien felt the world shift around him as pieces of a horrible puzzle clicked into place. Vanessa's rapid decline, her insistence on maintaining normal routines even as she grew weaker, her final week spent in what he'd thought was pain-induced delirium, but now realized might have been conscious communication. With forces beyond human understanding, she sacrificed herself to protect him, he whispered. And her sacrifice has been working. Until now. The discovery of that hive structure suggests Kenneth's abilities are growing stronger, making him harder to hide. Mrs. Roosevelt pulled out her journal, turning to entries marked with Vanessa's handwriting. She wrote about this possibility. There are protocols, places where gifted children can be trained safely while remaining connected to their families, but there are also people who would rather see these children controlled or eliminated than allowed to develop their full potential, Dr. Santos added grimly. Vanessa's final message to me was a warning that government agencies had become aware of the local supernatural activity. She was afraid they would come for Kenneth. As if summoned by their conversation, Kenneth suddenly straightened, his expression becoming alert and focused. Dad, there are cars coming. Black cars with people who feel wrong inside. Darien looked out Mrs. Roosevelt's front window and saw exactly what his son had predicted. 3 dark sedans turning onto their street, moving with the purposeful coordination of official vehicles. Through Mrs. Roosevelt's back window, he could see similar cars positioning themselves around their house. It's starting, Mrs. Roosevelt said, her voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. The question now is whether we trust Kenneth's gifts enough to let him guide us through what comes next. Kenneth took his father's hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong and reassuring. Don't be scared, Dad. Mom left us everything we need to be safe. But we have to be brave enough to use it, looking into his son's eyes, those deep brown eyes that had inherited Vanessa's wisdom but now held depths of understanding that no 8-year-old should possess. Darien realized that the protective strategies he'd relied on for the past 6 months were no longer adequate. Kenneth wasn't just a child who needed sheltering from supernatural forces. He was becoming something extraordinary that required a completely different kind of guidance and protection. The black cars had stopped in front of their house. Men in dark suits were approaching Mrs. Roosevelt's front door, and somewhere beneath their feet, according to Kenneth's strange new awareness, ancient voices were rising in harmonies of warning and preparation. Darien made a decision that would have terrified him a week ago, but now felt like the only sane response to an insane situation. He would trust his son's impossible knowledge, follow Mrs. Roosevelt's decades of experience, and honor Vanessa's sacrifice by accepting the extraordinary responsibility of raising a child whose abilities might represent the next step in human evolution. "Show us what we need to do," he told Kenneth, squeezing his son's hand as the doorbell rang and their old life ended forever. The map spread across Mrs. Roosevelt's kitchen table revealed patterns that Darien had lived among for 5 years without ever noticing. Vanessa's careful markings showed clusters of supernatural activity centered around underground water sources, with connecting lines that suggested some kind of network spanning the entire Charlotte metropolitan area. Each mark corresponded to addresses where Mrs. Roosevelt had documented unusual phenomena, creating a web of interconnected supernatural hotspots that included their own home at its center. "Your house sits on a convergence point," Dr. Santos explained via their ongoing video call, her image pixelated but her voice clear through Mrs. Roosevelt's laptop speakers. "Mister, that's why the protective entity chose your oak tree as a communication hub. It's also why Kenneth's abilities are developing so rapidly." The men in black suits had been circling the neighborhood for 3 days, conducting what they called routine environmental assessments, but which felt more like surveillance to everyone involved. Kenneth's abilities had grown stronger under the pressure, allowing him to sense their locations and intentions with uncanny accuracy. "There are 5 of them today," he reported from Mrs. Roosevelt's front window, his young face serious with concentration. "3 are just doing their jobs, but 2 of them know about kids like me. They're waiting for me to do something big enough to prove what I am." Mrs. Roosevelt closed her journal and moved to stand beside Kenneth, her weathered hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Over the past few days, she'd become more than a helpful neighbor. She'd emerged as a strategic ally with decades of experience in protecting supernatural children from discovery. "We need to accelerate your training," she said. "If they're planning to move against you, you need to understand how to control your gifts, rather than simply experience them." The training sessions took place in Mrs. Roosevelt's basement, which Darien discovered had been converted into something resembling a combination laboratory and shrine. Charts covered the walls, showing lunar cycles, electromagnetic field measurements, and genealogical trees of families that had produced gifted children. Crystals and metal objects were arranged in patterns that Kenneth seemed to understand instinctively, while Mrs. Roosevelt took careful notes of his responses to various stimuli. "The abilities aren't random," she explained, as Kenneth successfully predicted the sequence of cards she would draw from a specially prepared deck. "They follow patterns based on personality, family history, and the specific type of dimensional energy that influences each child." Kenneth's gifts center around temporal perception and empathic connection to non-human intelligence. Darien watched his son demonstrate abilities that belonged in science fiction, rather than suburban Charlotte, feeling a mixture of pride and terror that was becoming his default emotional state. Kenneth could sense impending events hours before they occurred, communicate with the entities that inhabited the underground networks, and occasionally display knowledge of places and people he'd never encountered in normal reality. "Is this what Vanessa went through?" he asked Mrs. Roosevelt during a break, while Kenneth napped on her living room couch, exhausted by the morning's training session. Vanessa's gifts were different but related. She could channel protective energy and create barriers that shielded sensitive children from detection. But using those abilities came with a physical cost that ultimately— Mrs. Roosevelt paused, choosing her words carefully. She made a choice to use her life force to protect Kenneth. It wasn't the cancer that killed her, Darien. It was love. The conversation was interrupted by Kenneth stirring on the couch, his expression immediately alert despite having been asleep moments before. "Dad, Dr. Patel is coming. Something's wrong with the twins." Dr. Raj Patel appeared at Mrs. Roosevelt's door 5 minutes later, his usual calm demeanor replaced by parental panic. "Asha and Mira have been having the same dream for 3 nights," he said without preamble. "They're describing places that don't exist and speaking words in a language I don't recognize. My wife thinks I'm overreacting, but after seeing what's been happening with Kenneth, bring them over," Mrs. Roosevelt said immediately. "The abilities often manifest in clusters, especially among children who've been in close contact with someone like Kenneth." The Patel twins arrived hand in hand, their usual chattering energy replaced by a subdued awareness that made them seem older than their 8 years. Like Kenneth, they displayed the kind of mature understanding that suggested they'd been exposed to knowledge beyond their developmental stage. "We've been dreaming about the singing caves," Asha said quietly, sitting beside Kenneth on Mrs. Roosevelt's couch, "and the people made of light who want to teach us things," Mira added, completing her sister's thought in a way that had become their new pattern of communication. Kenneth took their hands with the natural authority of someone who'd been navigating supernatural experiences longer than his friends. "It's scary at first, but they're trying to help us. The underground voices want to keep us safe from the bad people." Mrs. Roosevelt documented the twins' experiences in her journal while Dr. Patel struggled to process the reality that his daughters had been drawn into the same impossible situation affecting Kenneth. As a medical professional, he understood the importance of empirical evidence, but as a father, he was primarily concerned with protecting his children from forces he couldn't comprehend or control. "How many other families are dealing with this?" he asked Mrs. Roosevelt. "In this immediate area, I've identified 12 children showing various levels of supernatural sensitivity. Globally, Dr. Santos estimates there are several thousand, with new cases emerging as dimensional barriers continue to weaken." The implications were staggering. What they'd initially seen as an isolated incident involving Kenneth and their oak tree was apparently part of a worldwide phenomenon affecting children across multiple continents and cultures. The protective entities, the government surveillance, the underground networks, all pieces of a much larger picture that was only now becoming visible. Kenneth stood and moved to Mrs. Roosevelt's back window, his posture suddenly tense. "They're coming back, but this time they have someone with them who feels like us." Outside, the familiar black sedans were approaching, but the lead vehicle carried additional passengers. When they stopped and the doors opened, a woman in her 30s emerged alongside the government agents, a woman who radiated the same subtle energy signature that Kenneth had learned to associate with supernatural gifts. "She's like me," Kenneth said quietly. "But something's wrong with her. She's scared and angry and—" He paused, his face scrunching with concentration. "She doesn't want to be helping them." Mrs. Roosevelt joined Kenneth at the window, her expression grim. "They've brought a gifted adult to help them identify and catalogue the children. Someone they've either coerced or conditioned into cooperation." Dr. Patel moved protectively toward his daughters, while Darien felt the familiar surge of parental fury that had become his response to any threat against Kenneth. But this time, the threat wasn't supernatural entities or mysterious hive structures. It was human beings who viewed children like Kenneth as resources to be controlled rather than individuals to be protected. "What do we do?" he asked Mrs. Roosevelt, trusting her decades of experience over his own protective instincts. "We give Kenneth and the twins the choice," she said simply. "They can hide their abilities and hope to avoid detection, or they can embrace their gifts and learn to use them as tools for protecting themselves and others like them." Kenneth turned from the window, his young face set with determination that reminded Darien painfully of Vanessa during her final months. "I don't want to hide anymore, Dad. Mom didn't hide when she protected me. I want to learn how to protect other kids," looking at his son, this extraordinary child who'd inherited impossible abilities along with his mother's courage. Darien realized that the choice Mrs. Roosevelt offered wasn't really about Kenneth at all. It was about whether Darien himself was brave enough to support his son's transformation into something beyond normal human experience, even if that meant accepting risks he couldn't control or fully understand. The original property deed, yellowed with age and written in the careful script of 1890s legal documentation, told a story that made Mrs. Roosevelt's decades of supernatural observations suddenly comprehensible. The land beneath their neighborhood had been the site of a Catawba Indian settlement, abandoned not due to European colonization, but because of what the tribal records described as children who walked between worlds and brought unwelcome visitors from the shadow places. The indigenous peoples understood what we're only beginning to rediscover. Dr. Santos explained during their evening video conference. Certain geographical locations serve as natural conduits between dimensions. The Catawba moved their settlement specifically because gifted children in this area were attracting attention from entities they couldn't control. Kenneth sat cross-legged on the floor, absently sorting through Mrs. Roosevelt's collection of crystals, while the adults discussed the historical context of his abilities. His supernatural gifts had grown stronger throughout the day, allowing him to sense emotional states in people blocks away and predict minor events with startling accuracy. Most remarkably, he'd prevented a serious accident by insisting that Mrs. Patel take a different route to the grocery store, avoiding an intersection where a drunk driver would run a red light 20 minutes later. The abilities aren't a curse, Kenneth said without looking up from the crystals, which had begun arranging themselves into complex geometric patterns under his unconscious influence. The underground voices explained it to me. We're supposed to be bridges between their world and ours, but some people want to use us as weapons instead. Dr. Patel, who'd been documenting his daughter's experiences with the methodical precision of a medical professional, looked up from his notes. Kenneth, when you say some people, do you mean the government agents who've been surveilling the neighborhood? Not exactly. The agents are just doing what they're told. But the people giving the orders know about kids like us because they used to be like us. They learned how to use their gifts for controlling others instead of helping them. The implications of Kenneth's statement rippled through the assembled. Adults like a physical force. Dr. Santos leaned closer to her camera, her expression shifting from academic interest to personal concern. Kenneth, are you saying that some gifted adults work with government agencies to identify and recruit children with supernatural abilities? The lady they brought today used to protect kids like me. But something bad happened to her family, and now she helps the bad people because she's afraid they'll hurt the children she has left. Mrs. Roosevelt shared a meaningful look with Darien. They'd all sensed something troubling about the woman accompanying the government agents, but Kenneth's empathic abilities had revealed the human tragedy behind her cooperation. She wasn't a willing collaborator, but a coerced parent, making impossible choices to protect her own children. We need to reach out to her, Mrs. Roosevelt said firmly. If she's being forced to work against gifted children, she might be willing to help us if we can offer her family protection. The conversation was interrupted by Asha and Meera Patel, who'd been playing quietly in Mrs. Roosevelt's backyard, but now rushed inside with expressions of urgent concern. The singing stopped, Asha announced, her usual bright demeanor replaced by worry. All at once, like someone turned off a radio, Meera added. And now the air feels wrong. Kenneth immediately stood, the crystals around him scattering as his attention focused on something the adults couldn't perceive. His young face went pale, and when he spoke, his voice carried the strange resonance they'd learned to associate with direct communication from the underground entities. They're in danger. The people who've been protecting us. Something's attacking their safe places. Dr. Santos's image on the laptop screen flickered, and when it stabilized, her usually composed expression showed raw fear. Kenneth, I'm receiving reports from contacts around the world. Protected sites are going dark simultaneously. Someone with detailed knowledge of our network is systematically compromising our safe houses. The full horror of their situation became clear. The government agents hadn't just been surveilling their neighborhood. They'd been using information gathered from coerced gifted adults to map the entire international network of people protecting supernatural children. And now that network was under coordinated attack. "Dad," Kenneth said quietly, taking Darien's hand with fingers that trembled despite his mature understanding of their crisis. "We have to choose right now. Either we run and hope they don't find us, or we stay and fight for all the kids who can't protect themselves." Darien looked around Mrs. Roosevelt's living room at the people who'd become their extended family over the past week. Dr. Patel holding his daughters close, Mrs. Roosevelt clutching her journal of decades-long observations, Dr. Santos's concerned face on the laptop screen, all of them looking to him and Kenneth for decisions that would affect not just their own safety, but the lives of gifted children worldwide. "What would your mother do?" he asked Kenneth, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mom would say that gifts aren't just for the people who have them. They're for protecting everyone who needs protection." The simple wisdom in Kenneth's words, wisdom that somehow combined 8-year-old clarity with ancient understanding, helped Darien recognize what Vanessa had been trying to teach him through her sacrifice. True protection didn't mean hiding from dangerous responsibilities. It meant accepting those responsibilities and finding the courage to face them together. "Then we stay," Darien said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing them to. "We learn how to use Kenneth's abilities to help other children, and we trust that the people who've been protecting gifted kids for generations will teach us how to do it safely." Kenneth smiled, the first expression of pure joy Darien had seen from him since discovering the Hive structure, and hugged his father with arms. That seemed surprisingly strong for such a small person. "The underground voices say thank you," Kenneth whispered, "and Mom says she's proud of us." Outside, the black sedans had returned with additional vehicles, but this time their arrival felt different. Instead of surveillance and threat, Darien sensed anticipation and preparation. The entities that had been protecting gifted children for centuries were mobilizing for a confrontation that had been building across generations. Mrs. Roosevelt opened her journal to a fresh page, her pen poised to document whatever would happen next. "The real story begins now," she said quietly. "Everything up to this point has just been preparation." And as Kenneth moved toward the window to observe the approaching vehicles, his posture straightened with a confidence that suggested he was ready to accept whatever extraordinary destiny his supernatural gifts would demand. The frightened child, who'd pointed out a strange structure in their oak tree, had transformed into someone prepared to stand between the forces that would exploit gifted children and the innocents who needed protection. The choice had been made. Now came the test of whether they possessed the courage and wisdom to see it through. The letter waited in Vanessa's jewelry box, sealed in an envelope marked "For Darien when Kenneth shows his true nature." Mrs. Roosevelt had known about it for 2 years, but respected Vanessa's instructions to reveal it only when Kenneth's abilities became impossible to deny or control. Now, as government vehicles surrounded their neighborhood and Kenneth demonstrated powers that defied rational explanation, the time had finally arrived. Darien's hands shook as he opened the envelope, recognizing Vanessa's handwriting, but sensing immediately that these words carried a weight different from her usual gentle communication. This wasn't a love letter or final goodbye. This was a confession that would reframe everything he thought he understood about his wife's death and his son's extraordinary gifts. "My dearest Darien," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Kenneth has begun manifesting abilities that prove what I've suspected since before his birth. Our son isn't simply a gifted child. He's part of something much larger and more significant than either of us ever imagined. And I didn't die from cancer. I made a choice to transfer my life energy to create permanent protective barriers around him, knowing it would cost me everything, but hoping it would give him the time he needed to grow strong enough to defend himself. The words hit Darien like physical blows, each revelation forcing him to reconsider memories he thought he understood. Vanessa's rapid decline hadn't been medical tragedy but deliberate sacrifice. Her final weeks of seeming delirium had actually been conscious communion with forces beyond human comprehension. Her insistence on maintaining normal family routines, even as she weakened, had been her way of giving Kenneth as much ordinary childhood as possible. Before his extraordinary destiny claimed him, Kenneth was born during a rare convergence of dimensional barriers, the letter continued. The entities that created the hive structure in our oak tree have been monitoring him since infancy, not as a threat to be controlled, but as a bridge between worlds that could help both species evolve beyond their current limitations. But other forces, human organizations that view gifted children as weapons to be harvested rather than individuals to be protected, became aware of his potential before his abilities fully manifested. Mrs. Roosevelt sat beside Darien as he read, her weathered hands folded in her lap, and her expression carrying decades of carefully guarded knowledge. Vanessa came to me when she first realized what Kenneth was becoming, she said quietly. She'd been experiencing prophetic dreams about his future, visions of the choice he would eventually face between hiding his gifts or using them to protect other children like himself. Why didn't she tell me? Darien asked, though part of him already understood the answer. Because she knew you would have tried to find another way. You would have researched medical treatments, consulted specialists, done everything in your power to give Kenneth a normal childhood. But normalcy was never an option for him. The best she could do was buy him time to develop the emotional strength he'd need to accept his responsibilities. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, drawn by the emotional intensity of their conversation. His young face showed understanding beyond his years, and when he spoke, his voice carried the gentle wisdom that had become his new normal. Mom's still protecting me, isn't she, Dad? I can feel her sometimes, like a warm blanket around my thoughts when the underground voices get too loud. Dr. Santos's voice crackled through the laptop speakers, her excitement evident despite the poor connection. Darien, what Kenneth is describing confirms something I've theorized for years. Gifted adults who sacrifice their life energy to protect children don't simply die. They become part of the dimensional matrix that shields sensitive individuals from detection. Vanessa isn't gone. She's become an active component of the protective network. The implications were staggering. Vanessa hadn't just died to protect Kenneth. She'd transformed into something that could continue protecting him indefinitely. The comfort Darien had attributed to memories and wishful thinking had actually been his wife's continuing presence. Filtered through supernatural forces he was only beginning to understand. The entities in the hive aren't malevolent, Kenneth said, settling beside his father with the casual authority he'd developed over the past week. They've been guarding kids like me for thousands of years, trying to help us grow up safely so we can build bridges between their world and ours. But the people who want to control us see those bridges as weapons instead of gifts. Kenneth, Dr. Santos said through the laptop, when you communicate with these entities, do they show you images of what they're trying to protect you from? Kenneth nodded, his expression growing serious. They show me places where kids like me are kept in rooms with no windows, being taught to use their gifts to hurt people instead of help them. And they show me the people who used to be like me, but chose to work for the bad guys because they were too scared to fight. The woman who'd accompanied the government agents earlier that day, the gifted adult, Kenneth had sensed was being coerced, represented the future that Vanessa had died to prevent. Children with supernatural abilities, isolated from their families and communities, conditioned to use their gifts for control rather than protection. But there's something else, Kenneth continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded complete attention from every adult in the room. The underground voices told me that Mom left more than just protection. She left instructions for how to find other families like ours and help them stay together instead of being separated. Mrs. Roosevelt opened her journal to pages, marked with Vanessa's handwriting, entries Darien had seen before but hadn't understood were actually coded messages for other parents facing supernatural circumstances with their children. Your wife created a network, Mrs. Roosevelt explained. Families with gifted children who support each other instead of struggling alone. The government agents know about some of us, but they don't understand that we're not hiding from them. We're building something stronger than anything they can control through fear and coercion. Dr. Patel looked up from his own notes, understanding dawning in his expression. That's why Asha and Mira's abilities manifested so strongly after spending time with Kenneth. It's not just proximity to him, it's proximity to the protective network Vanessa established. The pieces of an incredible puzzle were finally falling into place. What had seemed like random supernatural events affecting isolated families was actually a coordinated response to organized threats against gifted children. Vanessa hadn't just protected Kenneth. She'd created a model for how supernatural families could support each other while resisting attempts to separate and exploit them. "Dad," Kenneth said quietly, taking Darien's hand with fingers that had grown steadier and stronger over the past week, "I know this is scary, but I'm not sick and I'm not broken. I'm just different in ways that can help people. Mom taught me that being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be responsible for." Looking into his son's eyes, those deep brown eyes that had inherited Vanessa's compassion, but now held depths of understanding that stretched beyond normal human experience, Darien finally understood what his wife had been trying to prepare him for. Kenneth's supernatural abilities weren't a burden to be managed or a condition to be cured. They were gifts to be cultivated and shared, tools for building connections between worlds and protecting innocence from those who would exploit the extraordinary for selfish purposes. "Your mother was right," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion that combined grief, pride, and acceptance in equal measure. "You're not broken, buddy. You're exactly what the world needs you to be." Kenneth smiled and hugged his father, and in that moment, Darien felt something he hadn't experienced since Vanessa's death, complete certainty that they were moving in the right direction, no matter how impossible that direction might seem to outside observers. The government vehicles were still positioned throughout their neighborhood, and the forces that wanted to control gifted children hadn't disappeared. But they were no longer facing those challenges alone. They were part of something larger, a community of families who understood that some gifts were too precious to be surrendered to fear. The protective amulet had been hidden in plain sight for 8 years, disguised as Vanessa's favorite necklace, a simple pendant that Kenneth had seen her wear countless times, but which he now recognized as something far more significant than jewelry. Mrs. Roosevelt retrieved it from the jewelry box where it had waited alongside Vanessa's final letter, its silver surface warming immediately when Kenneth touched it. She charged it with protective energy over the course of years. Mrs. Roosevelt explained as the pendant began to emit a soft light that pulsed in rhythm with Kenneth's heartbeat. "But it requires conscious activation from both you and your father to reach its full potential." Outside, the government vehicles had been joined by additional cars, carrying people Kenneth could sense were gifted adults. Some coerced into cooperation, like the woman they'd seen earlier, but others who radiated the kind of determined resistance he associated with Mrs. Roosevelt and Dr. Santos. The supernatural community was mobilizing, and their neighborhood had become the focal point for a confrontation that had been building across generations. Dr. Santos's image flickered on the laptop screen as she coordinated responses from gifted families around the world. "The simultaneous attacks on our safe houses weren't random," she reported grimly. "Someone with intimate knowledge of our network has been systematically compromising our security. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed we were trying to hide from them rather than preparing to confront them." Kenneth stood at Mrs. Roosevelt's front window, the amulet around his neck growing brighter as his abilities expanded to encompass the entire neighborhood. He could sense the fear and determination of the approaching agents, the conflicted loyalties of the coerced gifted adults, and something else, the presence of genuinely malevolent forces that viewed children like him as resources to be harvested rather than individuals to be protected. They brought someone really bad with them this time, he said quietly, his young voice carrying an authority that made every adult in the room pay attention. Someone who used to be like me, but chose to hurt people instead of help them. The Patel twins had been experiencing synchronized visions throughout the afternoon. Images of underground tunnels filled with imprisoned children, research facilities where supernatural abilities were studied and weaponized, and most disturbing, training centers where gifted youths were conditioned to use their powers against their own communities. "We have to stop them," Asha said, with uncharacteristic seriousness, not just for us, but for all the other kids who don't have families to protect them. Mira added, Dr. Patel struggled visibly with the reality that his 8-year-old daughters were discussing matters of life and death with the mature understanding of experienced adults. How can children possibly stand against government agencies and trained operatives? "Because we're not standing alone," Kenneth replied, the amulet around his neck flaring brighter as he spoke. "Mom didn't just protect me. She connected me to everyone who's been protecting gifted kids for centuries. All those people, all that knowledge, all that power, it's available to us if we're brave enough to accept it." Mrs. Roosevelt moved to her basement and returned with items Darien had never seen before. Crystals that hummed with energy, metal objects that seemed to bend light around themselves, and maps that showed not just geographical features, but dimensional boundaries and energy flows. Kenneth handled these artifacts with instinctive understanding, arranging them into patterns that created a protective field encompassing several city blocks. "The underground entities are rising," Kenneth announced, his connection to forces beyond normal reality growing stronger by the moment. "They've been waiting for permission to actively protect us instead of just hiding us. But they need a human bridge, someone who can speak for both worlds and help them understand what we're fighting for." The weight of responsibility in Kenneth's words made Darien's chest tight with protective fear. His 8-year-old son was being asked to serve as ambassador between species, to make decisions that could affect the safety of gifted children worldwide. Every parental instinct screamed against allowing Kenneth to accept such enormous responsibility. "Buddy, you don't have to carry this alone," he said, kneeling beside Kenneth and placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Kenneth smiled with the radiant joy that had been missing from his expression since Vanessa's death. "I know, Dad. That's what the amulet is for. It lets you share the load instead of making me carry it by myself." Dr. Santos leaned forward on the laptop screen, her expression urgent. "Kenneth, our contacts report that the approaching forces include operatives who specialize in capturing gifted children alive. They're not planning to negotiate. They're planning to take you and anyone else who demonstrates supernatural abilities. Then we don't give them the chance," Kenneth said with calm determination that reminded Darien painfully of Vanessa during her final months. "The underground people are done hiding. They want to show everyone what we're really protecting ourselves from." The amulet around Kenneth's neck suddenly blazed with light that filled Mrs. Roosevelt's living room, and for a moment every adult present could sense what Kenneth had been experiencing for weeks, the vast network of protective entities that had been shielding gifted children from forces that viewed them as weapons rather than individuals with inherent worth and dignity. But more than that, they could feel Vanessa's presence, not as memory or wishful thinking, but as an active force continuing to guide and protect her family from beyond the boundaries of normal existence. "She's still here," Darien whispered, tears streaming down his face as he finally understood what Kenneth had been trying to tell him. She never left us. She's here, and she brought help, Kenneth confirmed, his young voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. Everyone who ever died protecting a gifted child is here. They've been waiting for us to stop hiding and start fighting back. Mrs. Roosevelt opened her journal to a fresh page, her pen steady despite the supernatural energy filling her home. Whatever happens next, we document it. Future families need to know that standing together is possible. Dr. Patel gathered his daughters close, his medical training warring with his parental instincts as he tried to process the reality that his children had become part of something far larger than family or neighborhood concerns. Asha, Mira, are you certain you want to be part of this? Once we cross this line, there's no going back to ordinary life. The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications, then nodded with synchronized certainty. Dad, we've been dreaming about the children who don't have families to protect them, Asha said softly. If we don't help now, who will help them? Mira added, with the simple logic that only children possess. Outside, the formation of vehicles had completed their perimeter around the neighborhood. Kenneth's enhanced awareness allowed him to provide a running commentary on their positioning and intentions. 23 agents, 7 gifted adults working under coercion, 2 individuals whose supernatural abilities had been deliberately corrupted for destructive purposes, and 1 person whose energy signature made him recoil with instinctive terror. The really bad one is someone who used to be like us, but chose power over protection, Kenneth explained, his grip tightening on his father's hand. The underground voices are scared of him, because he knows how to hurt them, how to break the connections between their world and ours. Mrs. Roosevelt closed her journal and moved to the window, her 78-year-old frame straightening with determination that transformed her from elderly neighbor into formidable defender. They're making their final approach. Kenneth, it's time. The amulet around Kenneth's neck pulsed brighter, and suddenly the basement artifacts Mrs. Roosevelt had collected over decades began resonating with harmonic frequencies that seemed to make the air itself sing. The sound was beautiful and otherworldly, but more importantly, it was a signal that reached far beyond their immediate neighborhood. The network is activating, Dr. Santos reported through the laptop, excitement evident in her voice despite their dangerous circumstances. We're receiving confirmation from protected sites around the world. Families with gifted children are linking together simultaneously. Kenneth's amulet is serving as a focal point for global coordination. Darien felt the weight of history settling around them as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about protecting his son or their small community. They were participating in the emergence of gifted children from centuries of hiding. The first coordinated effort to openly resist forces that had exploited supernatural abilities while keeping their existence secret from the general population. Dad, Kenneth said quietly, his young face serious with the gravity of what he was about to ask. I need you to help me open the connection fully, but once we do, everyone will know about us. There won't be any more hiding for any gifted families. The choice Kenneth offered was the same one Vanessa had faced. Accept extraordinary responsibility with potentially devastating consequences, or prioritize personal safety while allowing injustice to continue unchallenged. Looking into his son's eyes, Darien saw not just Kenneth, but echoes of every child who had ever needed protection from forces too powerful for them to face alone. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. Kenneth took his father's hands and placed them on the amulet, which immediately began to pulse with warmth that seemed to flow directly into Darien's chest. Just love me, Dad. Love me enough to trust that Mom knew what she was doing when she gave us this gift. The moment their combined energy activated the amulet's full potential, the world changed in ways that would be felt across continents and dimensions. Light poured from the pendant, but this wasn't ordinary illumination. It was conscious, purposeful energy that carried messages of hope and coordination to gifted families who had been struggling alone against impossible odds. Mrs. Roosevelt's house became a beacon visible, not just to human eyes, but to the supernatural entities who had been protecting gifted children for millennia. The oak tree in their backyard began to glow as the hive structure expanded and transformed, no longer hiding, but openly displaying the beauty and complexity of interdimensional architecture. "They're coming," Kenneth announced, but his tone carried anticipation rather than fear. "All of them. The people who've been hiding, the ones who've been fighting alone, the families who thought they were the only ones dealing with impossible things. They're coming to help." Through Mrs. Roosevelt's windows, they could see figures emerging from houses throughout the neighborhood, parents and children who had been concealing supernatural abilities, elderly residents who had been documenting strange occurrences for decades, and individuals whose gifts had remained dormant until this moment of collective activation. But most remarkably, they could see the protective entities themselves, no longer confined to underground hiding places, but rising into visible reality as translucent beings of light and energy who radiated the kind of gentle strength Kenneth had learned to associate with safety and guidance. "The confrontation begins now," Mrs. Roosevelt said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been preparing for this moment for most of her adult life. "But we're not facing it as isolated individuals anymore. We're facing it as a community that spans species and dimensions." Kenneth squeezed his father's hand one final time before stepping toward the front door, the amulet around his neck blazing with light that seemed to draw power from every act of love and protection ever performed by parents trying to keep their children safe. "Ready, Dad?" he asked, his 8-year-old voice somehow carrying the wisdom of ages. "Ready," Darien replied, and together they opened the door to face whatever forces had been hunting gifted children in darkness, knowing that darkness could not survive when so many lights chose to shine together. The government forces had expected to find a single family trying to hide a gifted child. Instead, they discovered an entire neighborhood transformed into something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Agent Morrison, the operations leader, spoke into his radio with barely controlled frustration as his carefully planned extraction turned into something resembling a supernatural festival. "Base, we have a situation. The targets are not attempting to flee or hide. Repeat, they are not attempting to flee or hide. They appear to be—" He paused, searching for words to describe what his eyes insisted was impossible. "They appear to be welcoming us." Kenneth stood in Mrs. Roosevelt's front yard, surrounded by a gathering that included every gifted individual within a 3-mile radius. The Patel twins flanked him, their hands glowing with the same gentle energy that emanated from his amulet. Mrs. Roosevelt maintained her position near the porch, her journal open to document whatever would unfold. And behind them, barely visible but undeniably present, stood translucent figures that radiated protective warmth, the interdimensional entities that had been shielding gifted children for centuries. "We're not your enemies," Kenneth called out to the approaching agents, his 8-year-old voice somehow carrying clearly across the distance between them. "We want to show you what we're really protecting." The hive structure in their oak tree had transformed into something magnificent, a crystalline formation that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, clearly artificial but radiating such inherent beauty that even the hardened government operatives found themselves staring in wonder rather than reaching for weapons. Agent Morrison's radio crackled with urgent communication from his superiors. "Maintain distance. Do not engage until we understand what we're dealing with." But the gifted adult they'd brought for identification purposes, Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman whose own children had been taken by similar operations 2 years earlier, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Agent Morrison," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "these aren't the terrorists or weapons we were told to expect. These are families. These are children who've been hiding from us because they know what we do to people like them." Kenneth approached Dr. Chen with the fearless compassion that had emerged as his dominant characteristic. "They took your kids, didn't they? And they told you that if you helped them find other families like yours, They'd keep your children safe. Dr. Chen nodded, her professional composure crumbling as Kenneth's empathic abilities allowed him to understand her situation completely. My daughter Maya, my son Alex, they're being held in a facility in Colorado. They told me if I helped identify and catalog gifted children, my kids would be treated well and eventually released. They lied, Kenneth said gently. The underground voices showed me the places where they keep kids like us. They're not training centers or protective facilities. They're prisons where children are taught to use their gifts to hurt people instead of help them. The assembled neighbors, gifted individuals who had been living in secret fear for years, began sharing their own stories. Mrs. Patterson spoke of precognitive dreams that had helped her avoid accidents and disasters. The elderly Mr. Washington revealed telepathic abilities that had allowed him to locate missing persons. The young Martinez family demonstrated their children's talent for communicating with animals, which had made them invaluable during natural disaster response efforts. You see, Kenneth continued, addressing Agent Morrison directly, we're not dangerous. We're just different in ways that can help people. But some grown-ups want to use our differences to gain power over others. So they tell stories about us being threats that need to be controlled. The translucent figures surrounding the gathering began to solidify, revealing themselves as beings of remarkable beauty and obvious intelligence. They communicated primarily through harmonious tones that seemed to convey meaning directly to listeners' hearts rather than their minds. But Kenneth served as translator for the assembled humans. They say they've been protecting gifted children for thousands of years because they understand that our abilities are meant to build bridges between worlds, not weapons for conquering them. They're tired of hiding, and they want to work openly with humans who share their values. Agent Morrison found himself in an impossible situation. His orders had been clear: extract the gifted individuals for study and containment using whatever force proved necessary. But faced with children demonstrating obvious supernatural abilities while radiating such inherent gentleness and wisdom, those orders felt not just inappropriate but actively evil. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, in your professional assessment, do these individuals pose a threat to national security? Dr. Chen looked around the gathering, children playing with light and energy as naturally as other kids might play with toys. Adults using their gifts to create beautiful displays that brought joy rather than fear. Protective entities whose very presence seemed to make the air itself more peaceful. No, Agent Morrison, these people pose a threat to the organizations that profit from conflict and control. But they pose no threat to innocent populations or national security. If anything, they represent an evolution in human capability that could benefit everyone. Kenneth stepped closer to Agent Morrison, the amulet around his neck pulsing gently. You can make a choice right now. You can keep following orders from people who want to hurt kids like me, or you can help us protect families so they don't have to be scared anymore. The moment of decision had arrived, and Agent Morrison realized that his choice would determine not just the fate of this particular operation, but his own ability to live with himself afterward. Agent Morrison made his choice by lowering his weapon and removing his earpiece, cutting communication with superiors who had sent him to treat children as enemy combatants. His decision rippled through the assembled government forces, creating a moment of uncertainty that Kenneth immediately recognized as an opportunity for genuine dialogue. Thank you, Kenneth said simply, approaching Morrison with the trusting openness that had characterized all his interactions throughout this extraordinary week. Can you help us protect the other kids who are being held in places like where Dr. Chen's children are? Before Morrison could respond, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. The backup forces arriving weren't standard government agents, but private contractors employed by organizations that viewed gifted children as valuable commodities rather than individuals deserving protection. Kenneth. Dr. Santos's voice crackled through Mrs. Roosevelt's laptop, urgency evident despite the poor connection. Our global monitoring shows similar confrontations happening simultaneously worldwide. This isn't just about your neighborhood anymore. It's become a coordinated emergence of gifted communities everywhere. The Patel twins moved to stand beside Kenneth, their synchronized movements creating patterns of light that seemed to strengthen the protective barriers the interdimensional entities had established around their gathering. Other gifted children throughout the neighborhood emerged from their homes, no longer hiding their abilities, but openly demonstrating powers that ranged from telepathy and precognition to energy manipulation and communication with non-human intelligence. "We're not fighting them," Asha announced, her young voice carrying across the yard as she gestured toward the approaching helicopters. "We're showing them what they're really fighting against," Mira completed, her sisters' thought in their characteristic unified communication style. The protective entities surrounding the gathering began to sing harmonious tones that created visible waves of energy, rippling outward from their neighborhood to encompass the entire city. The song wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was an invitation to experience reality from a perspective that transcended ordinary human limitations. Morrison found himself affected by the music in ways his training hadn't prepared him for. Images flooded his consciousness, memories of every gifted child his organization had taken from their families. Visions of the fear and isolation those children experienced, and most powerfully, glimpses of what those children could accomplish if allowed to develop their abilities in supportive environments rather than controlling facilities. "My God," he whispered, understanding finally striking him with devastating clarity. "We're the bad guys in this story." Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on Morrison's shoulder, her own transformation from coerced collaborator to active ally complete. "It's not too late to become the good guys. These children are offering us a chance to choose protection over exploitation." Kenneth approached the oak tree, which had become a towering spire of crystalline beauty that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. When he placed his hands on its surface, the structure responded by opening like a flower, revealing an interior that defied spatial physics, vast chambers filled with amber light where rescued children from around the world were being healed and taught to use their gifts responsibly. "This is what we've been protecting," Kenneth announced, his voice somehow reaching everyone present, despite the growing noise from approaching aircraft. "Safe spaces where kids like us can learn from the people who've been guarding us for thousands of years. Not weapons training or mind control, just education about how to use our differences to help instead of hurt." The arriving contractors deployed with military precision, but as they approached the neighborhood perimeter, they encountered something unprecedented. The protective barriers established by the interdimensional entities didn't block or attack them. Instead, they provided the same empathic awareness that had transformed Morrison's understanding of his mission. One by one, the contractors began lowering their weapons as they experienced direct psychic contact with the children they'd been sent to capture. The emotional connection was overwhelmingly powerful. These weren't dangerous anomalies to be contained, but vulnerable young people who possessed extraordinary gifts they were trying to use responsibly. Mrs. Roosevelt stood on her porch, documenting the moment when decades of hidden supernatural activity finally emerged into open acknowledgement. "This is what Vanessa knew would happen," she called out to Darien, who was watching his son serve as ambassador between species with a mixture of pride and protective concern. The hiding was always temporary. Eventually, the gifted communities would grow strong enough to choose openness over secrecy. Kenneth turned to address the assembled crowd, government agents, private contractors, gifted families, and protective entities, his 8-year-old frame somehow containing the authority to speak for everyone who had ever been forced to choose between hiding their true nature and facing persecution for being different. "We're making a new agreement. Today," he announced, the amulet around his neck blazing with light that reached far beyond their physical location. "No more taking kids away from their families. No more secret facilities. No more using fear to control what people don't understand. Agent Morrison stepped forward, his decision made. What do you need from us to make that happen? Kenneth smiled with the radiant joy that had returned to his expression once he'd accepted his role as bridge between worlds. Help us build schools where gifted kids can learn alongside regular kids. Help us create communities where being different is celebrated instead of feared. Help us teach everyone that supernatural abilities are gifts meant for healing and protection, not weapons for conquest and control. The covenant was forming, an agreement between human authorities and interdimensional guardians to openly protect and nurture gifted children while ensuring their abilities served the greater good rather than narrow interests. And at its center stood Kenneth, no longer a frightened child, hiding extraordinary gifts, but a confident young ambassador ready to help both species evolve beyond the limitations that had kept them separate and afraid. 6 months later, the morning routine in the Hendricks household had evolved into something Vanessa would have recognized, but also found wonderfully surprising. Darien still made scrambled eggs and toast at the same kitchen table, and Kenneth still sat across from him with orange juice in the same blue plate setting. But now their breakfast conversations included casual references to interdimensional homework assignments, weekend visits with protective entities, and Kenneth's role as student ambassador at the newly established Center for Gifted Education. Mrs. Roosevelt says the memorial garden is ready for today's ceremony, Kenneth mentioned between bites of toast, his voice carrying the confident contentment that had become his normal tone. She planted Mum's favorite roses right next to the original oak tree. The transformation of their backyard had become a source of community pride rather than fear. The crystalline structure that had emerged from the Hive now served as a teaching center where gifted children learned to understand and control their abilities while maintaining connections to their families and normal childhood experiences. The oak tree itself had grown larger and more beautiful, its branches now supporting a treehouse where Kenneth and his friends held meetings with young people from around the world who were learning to navigate similar extraordinary circumstances. Darien looked through the kitchen window at the garden where neighbors gathered each morning for coffee and informal coordination of their integrated supernatural community. Mrs. Roosevelt, now officially recognized as the neighborhood's historian and cultural liaison, maintained her detailed journals while also serving as grandmother figure to every gifted child within a 10-block radius. The Patel twins had flourished under the new openness, their synchronized abilities developing into remarkable talents for translation between human languages, and the harmonic communications used by protective entities. Dr. Patel had established a medical practice specializing in the unique health considerations of gifted individuals, while Priya had developed computer programs that helped newly manifesting children understand and control their abilities through interactive educational games. Are you ready for the presentation today? Darien asked, referring to Kenneth's scheduled address to a United Nations committee studying the integration of supernatural communities into mainstream society. Kenneth nodded with the quiet confidence that had replaced his earlier uncertainty about his role in the world. Dr. Santos helped me prepare answers for the questions they're likely to ask. Mostly, they want to understand how we can contribute to solving problems instead of creating them. The international response to the emergence of gifted communities had varied dramatically across cultures and governments, but the consistent demonstration of benevolent intentions and genuine desire to help had gradually overcome most institutional resistance. Kenneth had become a spokesperson not because of his age, but because of his natural ability to communicate complex, interdimensional concepts in terms that ordinary humans could understand and appreciate. Agent Morrison, now serving as director of the Federal Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, stopped by their house each Tuesday evening for dinner and informal consultation on policy matters affecting gifted families. His transformation from enforcement agent to protective advocate had become a model for other government officials learning to work with supernatural communities rather than attempting to control them. The Colorado facility has been converted into a proper school, he'd reported during his most recent visit. Dr. Chen's children are thriving in the new environment, and they're helping us understand how to redesign other containment sites into educational centers that support families instead of separating them. The most remarkable change had been the gradual emergence of gifted individuals who had been hiding their abilities for decades. Adults who'd suppressed supernatural talents out of fear were finally able to develop and share their gifts openly, creating a multi-generational community that spanned the entire spectrum of human experience while incorporating guidance from protective entities who no longer needed to remain invisible, since Roosevelt's role as community elder had expanded to include coordination with similar neighborhoods around the world, using communication networks established by the interdimensional guardians to share resources and support systems across continents. Her daily journal entries now included correspondence with protective families in dozens of countries, creating a global database of successful integration strategies. "Kenneth," Darien said as they finished breakfast and prepared for another day that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier, "do you ever miss the time when life was simpler?" Kenneth considered the question with the thoughtful seriousness he brought to all important conversations. "I miss Mom being here with us in person," he said finally. "But I don't miss being scared of who I am or having to pretend I don't see and hear things that are really there. And I especially don't miss thinking we were alone in dealing with impossible stuff." They walked together toward the Center for Gifted Education, passing neighbors whose morning routines now included casual interactions with beings of light and energy who had become valued community members. Children played games that incorporated supernatural abilities alongside traditional playground activities, while adults consulted with interdimensional advisors on everything from gardening techniques to conflict resolution strategies. The memorial service for Vanessa and all the parents who had sacrificed themselves to protect gifted children took place in the community garden that had grown around their original oak tree. Families from around the world participated via the crystalline communication network, creating a gathering that transcended normal limitations of time and space. "She would be so proud," Mrs. Roosevelt said, placing a gentle hand on Darien's shoulder as Kenneth spoke to the assembled crowd about the legacy of protection and love that had made their current openness possible. "She is proud," Kenneth corrected gently, his connection to forces beyond ordinary reality, allowing him to sense his mother's continuing presence in ways that comforted rather than saddened him. "She and all the other parents who made this possible, they're still here, still protecting us, still guiding us toward the kind of world they dreamed we could build together." The ceremony concluded with the planting of a new tree, a sapling that had been grown from seeds provided by the protective entities, representing the hope that future generations would never have to choose between hiding their true nature and facing persecution for being extraordinary. As the community dispersed to continue their various activities, some involving perfectly normal work and school obligations, others incorporating responsibilities that stretched across dimensions, Darien found himself standing beside the original oak tree with Kenneth, both of them looking toward a future that promised challenges and wonders in equal measure. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Darien asked his remarkable son. "Always," Kenneth replied, his hand finding his father's with the confidence of someone who had learned that being different was not a burden to be hidden, but a gift to be shared responsibly. "As long as we're together." The morning sun filtered through leaves that seemed to hold more light than physics suggested was possible, and in that gentle radiance, both father and son could sense the continuing presence of the woman whose love had made their extraordinary life possible.